What if the most dangerous person on a plantation was the one who never raised her voice? They called her Martha, not Miss Martha, not even Auntie. Just Martha, the woman who kept everything spotless, said little, and knew more than anyone else ever guessed. By the time she turned 40, Martha had worked at Oakridge Plantation for nearly her entire life. She ironed every white shirt the master wore. She folded every dress the mistress owned. She scrubbed blood from linens no one else dared touch, and asked no questions while doing it. But behind those calloused hands and quiet eyes lived a mind sharper than any needle. She threaded. To the outside world, Martha was just the laundress. To the family, she was invisible. But to the enslaved who watched her, to the children who followed her shadow like it was a shelter, Martha was something different. She was safety, she was silence, she was steel, and still no one really knew her. Not the house staff who gossiped late into the night, not the mistress who gave her orders with a smile and looked the other way when her husband came home drunk and angry. No, and not the master himself who had once tried to break Martha years ago and failed. Because Martha was not a woman you could break. She was a woman who learned how to bend until you forgot she had ever been whole to begin with. Oakridge Plantation was nestled between the hills of central Virginia, surrounded by willow trees and sweet rot. Visitors said it looked like a painting: white house, green fields, soft-spoken workers. They didn't see the cracks beneath the surface. But Martha saw everything. She watched how the overseer's whip didn't strike flesh, but struck fear. She noticed which slaves were given shoes and which were forced to limp. She remembered every missing name and every lie told to explain them away. And yet she said nothing. Not when Eliza was beaten behind the cookhouse, not when Henry was sold in the middle of the night, not even when her own children disappeared. Yes, Martha had children once. Twins, a boy and a girl, born under the stars on a spring night long ago, when the air smelled like honeysuckle and rain. For a while they were her secret joy. She taught them songs only her grandmother knew, braided their hair with careful fingers, held them close at night, whispering stories in the dark. And then one Easter morning they were gone. No graves, no goodbyes. Just a vague answer: wandered too far. Must have drowned, but Martha knew her children didn't just wander. She never spoke of it, never accused, never cried in public. But after that day, something inside her changed. She became even quieter, even stronger, even more watchful. And the plantation carried on, unaware that the woman folding their Sunday linens had begun counting sins. Because Martha wasn't just washing clothes. She was washing guilt. She wasn't just ironing. She was flattening rage. And one day when the time came, she would not scream. She would not run. She would do what she had always done: move in silence, strike without warning, and leave behind no blood on her hands, only ashes. So if you're watching this, remember, history is not just made by those who shout or lead armies. Sometimes it's made by women like Martha, who carry pain quietly and wait. If this story has drawn you in, you'll want to see how it unfolds. Subscribe now, because the reckoning at Oakridge is only just beginning. On paper, Oakridge was the kind of place Northerners imagined when they wanted to believe the South was not so bad. Wide verandas, symmetrical gardens, a painted white house with green shutters, and freshly churned butter on the table. Visitors were charmed by the sight of enslaved women in crisp aprons carrying silver trays, of barefoot children laughing between tree swings, of the master tipping his hat like a gentleman. But paper is thin, and Oakridge's image? Thinner still, because beneath the sunlight and smiles, Oakridge was held together by silence and fear. The plantation sat on lue-by acres of good Virginia land, handed down across 4 generations. It had survived bad crops, bank panics, and family scandals, not because of luck, but because of control. The kind of control that didn't need whips on most days. The kind that knew how to smile while tightening the leash. And nobody understood that quiet grip better than Martha. She watched how the master, James Whitmore, didn't raise his voice, only his eyebrows. How he called slaves by their first names in public, but by numbers in his account book. How he punished with absence, taking a child away, sending a husband to the next county, renting out a wife who stepped out of line. Oh, there were no scars on backs at Oakridge, but there were scars behind every eye. The mistress, Clara, was just as precise. A woman of lace and law, she ran the household like a general. Everything matched, everything proper, except her heart, which had gone cold long before the wedding band settled on her finger. She spoke to Martha often, tell Sarah to starch the collars sharper. Make sure the hemline is exactly 3 fingers above the floor. I want the silver to shine like morning frost. She never once said thank you. Clara had lost 3 pregnancies in 5 years, and she blamed the house for it. The heat, the noise, the servants, especially Martha, who had managed to carry twins to term in a dirt-floor cabin. Martha felt the resentment in every sideways glance. She carried it silently, like the baskets of damp laundry on her back. Even the enslaved whispered among themselves, "There's something wrong in this house." Dishes fell without reason. Dogs barked at empty corners, and some swore they saw shadows walking in the fields long after sundown. But nothing was ever said aloud, because Oakridge didn't tolerate stories. It tolerated obedience. The only person who didn't play the game was Sarah. Sarah was 14, too old for the nursery and too smart for the yard. Martha had taken her under her wing after Sarah's mother vanished. Run off, they said. But Martha knew better. Sarah noticed the details. How Thomas, the master's son, had left town suddenly one spring. How the cellar was always locked after dark. How Martha sometimes traced her fingers over a pair of faded baby shoes when she thought no one was looking. She once asked Martha, "Did they take your children too?" Martha had looked at her and said nothing. No, but silence in a place like Oakridge was its own kind of scream. No. As the seasons turned, the house grew heavier, the flowers still bloomed, the dresses still twirled, the guests still came. No, but in the eyes of the staff, there was a quiet countdown. They didn't know when. No, they didn't know how, but something was building, and Martha was watching it all. And what happens when an image starts to crack, and the truth beneath it burns brighter than the lie? Keep watching. The mask of Oakridge is slipping, and what's behind it might change everything. Spring came early that year. The fields of Oakridge burst into color like they were trying to outshine the past. Azaleas bloomed near the porch. Honeysuckle vines curled up the trellis. The air smelled like sugar and smoke. No, it was Easter week, the biggest Sunday of the year, and no one worked harder than Martha. She boiled linens until they gleamed polished silver like it was worth more than life, pressed collars, stitched buttons, and laid out the Whitmore's Sunday best with trembling fingers no one noticed. But deep in her bones, she felt something stirring, not joy, not hope, a memory, a wound that refused to close. Because this time of year didn't bring celebration for Martha. It brought ghosts. Years earlier, during another Easter, her world had unraveled in a single afternoon. Her twins, Samuel and Grace, had just turned 7, bright-eyed, barefoot, full of questions. They loved Easter. It was the only day children on Oakridge could pretend to be free, running barefoot to hunt dyed eggs, picking wildflowers, laughing between the big oaks. That morning, Martha had braided Grace's hair into tight spirals. She buttoned Samuel's patched shirt and reminded him, "Stay where I can see you." And they nodded, giggled, and raced toward the field with other children. That was the last time she saw them alive. I know. It was around midday when the whispers began. "Has anyone seen the twins?" "Oh, no, they was just by the fence. I thought they went back with Miss Clara." Panic spread like smoke. A frantic search swept the plantation, the field, the barn, the woods near the creek. Even the overseer joined in, more out of obligation than concern. Hours passed. The sun began to dip. Then came the scream. A boy had found a ribbon, Grace's. Torn, muddy, near the riverbank. Oh, the water was shallow, only knee-deep, too shallow for 2 children to drown at once. Yet that's what they were told. They must have wandered off, must have fallen, drowned. That was the story. And that was the end of it. No burial, no investigation, no justice. No, just 2 tiny cloth bundles wrapped in silence and carried off before sunrise. The Whitmores held a small prayer service for appearances. Miss Clara cried more for the carpet that had been stained than the children lost. Martha didn't cry at all. She just folded their clothes one last time and never spoke their names again. But on this Easter, years later, the air smelled exactly the same trees, same blossoms, same soft wind whispering down the riverbank. And Martha couldn't escape the echo. No, she moved like a ghost through the house, reliving it all. The cracked egg under the tree, the whisper of water over stones, the final look Samuel gave her as he ran toward the woods. That night, she sat by the wash-house alone. In her lap, 2 small, hand-stitched dolls. One with a blue thread bow, one with tiny brown buttons for eyes. She hadn't looked at them in years. No, she lit a small oil lamp and whispered their names. Samuel, Grace. And in that silence, something shifted. No, because Martha didn't just miss her children. She didn't just mourn them. She knew, somewhere in her soul, they hadn't simply drowned. Too many pieces never fit. Why had the master's son disappeared the next day? Why did Clara forbid any talk of the twins afterward? Why had Martha found a scrap of blue ribbon, burned at the edge, behind the smokehouse weeks later? No, her children didn't wander off, they were taken. And as the bells of Easter Sunday approached once again, Martha stopped folding memories. She began folding plans. When grief turns into knowing, and knowing turns into purpose. Stay with this story, because the truth about Easter at Oakridge has only begun to rise. Secrets don't stay buried forever, especially not at Oakridge, where the ground was soaked in stories no one dared tell, and where silence was enforced like law. But Martha, she remembered how the cellar door had been locked tight for weeks after Easter, how Miss Clara demanded the rug in the East Room be replaced quickly, quietly, no questions asked, and how the master's son, Thomas, was suddenly sent away without a word of goodbye. No one questioned it. Not aloud, but Martha had eyes, and she'd kept them open every single day since. After the twins' deaths, Martha began collecting details, not in journals. Those could be found. Not in whispers. Those could be twisted. No, she did something smarter. She stitched them inside every hem, under every collar, in the folds of pillowcases no one ever inspected. She used thread to tell the truth, knots for names, colors for clues. One blue stitch near the neckline, Grace's ribbon. 3 red crosses inside a tablecloth's border, the day, the hour, the people present. A circle of gold thread, hidden beneath the master's napkin. A memory of the ring Thomas wore when she saw him leaving the woods, face-pale, hands shaking. Each piece of laundry Martha returned was a map, each stitch a message to a future reader. If one ever came. Martha never considered herself brave. She never shouted, never defied orders. She did what was asked. No, but beneath her steady hands was a storm building one thread at a time. And the house around her? It kept pretending the Whitmores went on with life. Miss Clara threw teas and pouted over faded curtains. James Whitmore played the role of Southern gentleman for his guests, sipping brandy and quoting scripture between jokes about the help. The other slaves, they coped. Some prayed, some drank, some hardened so deeply they forgot how to cry. But everyone avoided the cellar. It wasn't just because it was dark. It was because no one knew what had happened there, and everyone feared they already did. One evening, months after the tragedy, Martha overheard something in the parlor. Thomas was home briefly between travels. He didn't know she was near. He was speaking with his father, low voice, sharp tone. She was just a girl, Thomas muttered. A pause. She shouldn't have followed me. The master didn't reply. Then Thomas said something Martha never forgot. Anyway, it's taken care of. They buried the wrong truth. No, and that was when Martha stopped wondering. She knew her children weren't just victims of accident. They were collateral in a family's quiet, poisonous survival. From that night forward, she began preparing. Not for revenge, not exactly, but for reckoning. There's a difference. She began spending more time near the storage rooms, took note of where the oil was kept, how quickly embers caught on cotton when too dry. She learned the way doors creaked when opened at night, and how long the guards truly stayed awake. She taught Sarah, the young girl in her care, how to write her name in secret, and how to sew messages into handkerchiefs. Martha never told her why, but Sarah would remember. The plantation kept turning, like nothing had ever happened, but the stitches were multiplying, and the secrets beneath Oakridge? No, they were no longer safe, because sometimes truth hides in journals, sometimes in songs. But sometimes it's stitched in silence, and when enough threads pull tight, even the strongest lie will come undone. You want to know what Martha discovered next, and how she planned to use it. Keep watching. The truth is no longer buried. It's moving, and it's about to surface. They said he had changed. After 5 years away, Thomas Whitmore returned to Oakridge the week before Easter, and the house seemed to hold its breath. He stepped down from the carriage in a long coat, his boots polished, his hair neatly combed, older, taller, quieter. But to Martha, he looked exactly the same. Not because of how he wore, or the way he greeted the staff without eye contact, but because of what she saw in his eyes. The same cold stillness, the same careful detachment, the same shadow she saw the day her children vanished. His arrival was announced like a holiday. "Master Thomas is home," the housemaid whispered. "He's come for Easter," they said. "He's a gentleman now. Been living in Charleston, doing business, mingling with fine society." But not everyone was excited. The older workers went quiet. The younger ones watched from windows, and Martha, she ironed his suit coat with hands that had not shaken in years, because Thomas had been gone since that spring, the same spring Samuel and Grace disappeared. Coincidence? That's what they said. Business called him away, family matters, a future to build, But Martha remembered more than just his timing, She remembered the pale, shaken boy who stumbled into the house the night of the search, the torn sleeve, the scratch on his cheek, the way he avoided her eyes for days, then left without a word. Now he was back, confident, composed, and Martha watched. Thomas walked the property like a man inspecting what he believed was his. He greeted Sarah, now 16, with a smile that lingered a second too long. He praised the upkeep of the laundry, not realizing Martha still oversaw every thread. He even stood at the riverbank one morning, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the water as if expecting something to resurface. But Martha noticed everything he didn't say. He never asked about the children, never visited their old quarters. Never looked at her directly, except once. It was during supper preparations. Martha was arranging silver on the dining table. Yoel Thomas entered quietly. She felt him before she saw him. "Still here," he said with a hint of amusement. "Oh, yes," she replied, not looking up. "Thought you'd be long gone by now." "I go where I'm needed," Martha said, "and where I'm kept." Thomas gave a soft laugh, still sharp. Then he walked away, like nothing had passed between them, But Martha stood still for a long time afterward, her hand gripping the fork too tightly. That night, Sarah came to Martha with trembling hands. "He was watching me," she said, "in the hallway. Didn't say nothing. Just stared." Martha didn't speak. She pulled Sarah close, brushed the girl's hair, and whispered, "Keep the door locked. Don't go anywhere alone. And if I tell you to run, you run." Sarah nodded. The next day, Martha began her final embroidery, the one meant not for concealment, but for clarity. It was a panel of fine white linen. On it, she stitched a house engulfed in flames. Above it, 2 small stars. Below it, a single name, Thomas. She hid it behind a false panel in the washroom. Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted someone, someday, to know. Quote, to know that the man who smiled at Easter had once stood near the river as two children vanished. To know that power wears many masks, and that Martha, the laundress, the invisible hand, had seen behind every one. Oh, the house continued to hum with celebration. The guests were arriving, the choirs were rehearsing, the table was being set. But behind the curtain a reckoning was taking shape, because Thomas had returned. And Martha was no longer the woman who once wept behind the barn. She was something else now, something calm, something watching, something ready. Boss, what happens when the hunted begins to hunt, and the truth stands face to face with the man who buried it? Stay close. Martha's silence is sharpening, and Easter is coming. Easter Sunday arrived with birdsong and bells, and the house at Oakridge stirred before dawn. Everything had to be perfect. The linens were starched and crisp. The dining table glistened beneath rows of silver goblets and candle holders. The smell of ham and cornbread drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the scent of lilies in the hall. From the outside, it looked like a celebration. But for those who worked behind the walls, it felt more like a performance, and Martha had rehearsed every step. She rose before the others, as always. He boiled water, tended coals, prepared the mistress' dress with shaking fingers. No one would notice. No, her movements were practiced, steady, but in her chest. Something stirred, not grief, not anger, resolution. No, because this Easter would not end in sorrow. It would not echo the past. It would close a chapter. Downstairs, Thomas sat with the master, reading scripture. He read the resurrection verses slowly with a practiced tone, but never once did he speak the word forgiveness. The staff moved around them silently. Clara barked her usual orders, more flowers by the window, wiped the wine bottle again. Where's my necklace? Martha complied as always, but her ears were open. Her eyes watched every movement. Because Sunday was more than just a ritual. It was the final test. By mid-morning, guests began arriving, neighbors from nearby plantations, old friends, curious outsiders. The house buzzed with southern charm and artificial cheer, and in the middle of it all, Thomas smiled. He shook hands, poured wine, quoted verses. To them he was the returning son, the heir of Oakridge. A fine young man, but to Martha, and to Sarah watching from the shadows, he was something else. He was a mirror, a mask, and maybe a monster. Before dinner, the house paused for prayer. Everyone gathered in the parlor, slaves lining the walls, guests filling the chairs. James Whitmore led the blessing. He spoke of gratitude, of rebirth, of family. But when he said the word children, Martha's breath caught, and she looked toward the mantel. Still no pictures of Samuel and Grace, no mention, no memory, as if they'd never existed. And in that moment, she made her final decision. That afternoon, the table was set for 24, the roast was carved, the guests toasted. Laughter echoed through the halls, but something felt off, a tension under the silver, a stillness behind the chatter. Even Clara paused, watching Martha longer than usual. What's gotten into her? She whispered to a friend. She's been quiet. She's always quiet, the woman replied. But Clara frowned because she could feel it too. A weight, a waiting. Martha moved through the day like a shadow. She poured drinks, replaced napkins, smiled when expected. But every step brought her closer to the cellar. Because deep below the laughter and linen was the place where it all began, the place Thomas avoided, the one door that stayed locked, even now. And Martha had the key, not the metal one. The memory. She remembered the scent of burnt cloth, the sound of dragging feet, the way Thomas flinched when he heard the word Easter. And she knew what had to be done. As dusk approached, the house prepared for the final part of the evening, songs and brandy in the drawing room. Clara insisted on tradition. Easter must end with light, she said. But Martha knew not all light heals. Some light reveals, no. The table is set. The guests are seated. But behind the curtain, the truth is waiting to be served. Stay with this story, because Oakridge's final Easter supper is about to begin, and someone won't leave the table the same. Most guests at Oakridge never knew the Lily House had a cellar. It was tucked beneath the eastern wing, behind a false pantry door, past a narrow staircase carved from stone. Cool, damp, and silent, like it had been waiting for something. Only a few ever had reason to go down there. Fewer still came back unchanged. Martha had not seen the cellar in years, not since the spring her children vanished, not since the day Clara ordered her to stay in the washhouse. No exceptions. But she remembered the smell, earth, mildew, and smoke. She remembered the sound of the door slamming, the hurried footsteps, the silence that followed. For years she had pushed it away, told herself there was nothing left to find. No, but tonight the door was unlocked and Martha was ready. While the guests laughed upstairs, she moved like a whisper, carrying an empty basket and a folded tablecloth. She walked past the servants' quarters, down the hall toward the pantry. The corridor was empty. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. She opened the hidden door, descended each step slowly. The stone was cold against her feet, and the past was waiting below. The cellar hadn't changed. Mason jars lined the walls. Dust-covered crates sat like forgotten graves. And in the far corner, behind an old wine barrel, a stack of burned linens, Martha knelt beside them. She lifted a piece gently. It was lace, children's lace, and beneath it, something else, a piece of ribbon. Blue, frayed, burned at the edge. She stared at it for a long time, then placed it gently into her basket. Suddenly, footsteps. Martha froze. Someone was coming. She stepped behind the barrel, heart pounding, breath tight. The door creaked. A lantern appeared, and then Thomas. He moved cautiously, holding the light low, eyes scanning the shadows. He paused near the crates, reaching behind one. He pulled something out, a bundle wrapped in cloth. He stared at it for a moment, then tucked it beneath his coat. Then he turned back. Martha remained hidden, motionless. The door closed. Darkness returned. When she climbed the stairs minutes later, her hands were trembling, but her mind was clear. There was no doubt left, no question of accident or mischief. He had returned to the scene to retrieve something, to make sure no one found the rest. But someone had, that night, Martha stitched the ribbon into the hem of her apron, not hidden, not subtle. She wanted it seen. Because the final chapter was coming and everyone would have a role to play, even the house. And when secrets are buried in the dark, someone must light the way. Even if it burns, stay close. The house beneath Oakridge is no longer silent, and Martha has emerged from the cellar with the truth in hand. Smoke doesn't lie. You can hide a scream, cover a bruise, bury a memory. But once smoke rises, the truth has already begun to burn. And that Easter evening smoke came early to Oakridge. Martha moved through the house with new clarity. She folded napkins, poured cider, straightened candles. But in her mind, she was folding timelines, not linens. Everything pointed to Thomas. The cellar, the ribbon, the bundle beneath his coat, the way he avoided the old stories like they could catch fire. But Martha wasn't interested in confrontation. She was interested in witnesses. Because truth, when spoken too softly, gets buried again. It had to be loud. It had to be seen. She returned to the washhouse just before dusk. Sarah was waiting, nervously folding cloths. Martha placed the blue ribbon on the table. Sarah's eyes widened. That's Grace's. Yes, Martha said, steady. It was in the cellar. Sarah swallowed. For ye do to... Martha looked out the small cracked window, where the evening sun painted everything gold. We wait, she said, until the guests are seated. Then we light the fire. Sarah's breath caught. Miss Martha, not Martha. Not the house, Martha whispered. The truth. A signal Sarah didn't understand. Not fully, but she nodded anyway. Night fell. Inside the grand hall, the Easter supper began. Clinking glasses, roasted duck, the polished orchestra of Southern wealth. Martha moved between courses like clockwork, polite, invisible, Thomas raised his glass, made a toast, spoke of family redemption and homecomings. Everyone smiled, but outside in the shadows by the woodline, Sarah lit a single torch, and touched it to the dry cotton hung behind the wash house. Not enough to spread, just enough to send smoke, a column, a message, to the field hands, to the house staff, to the neighbors who always wondered, and to Thomas, who stepped outside moments later and froze. He saw it. That single line of smoke curling upward like a finger pointing to heaven. Martha stood in the yard, apron tight, the ribbon now clearly visible at her waist. Thomas's face hardened. He stepped toward her. "You know what you're doing?" he asked, voice low. "Yes," she replied. His jaw tightened. You think anyone will believe you?" Martha smiled, slow and tired. "They don't have to. The smoke's already speaking." And for the first time, Thomas looked unsure. Inside the house, whispers spread. "Something's burning." Was that the wash house? Where's the fire starting from? But no one panicked, because it wasn't a blaze. It was a warning, a sign. And it reached every corner of Oakridge. Later that night, the fire was put out easily. No damage, no danger. Just ashes and questions. And the next morning, every worker on the plantation knew that Martha had found something, that Thomas had been seen, that the house they worked beneath was not just full of fine china, but bones. A spark can ignite a forest, but sometimes all it needs to destroy a lie is a ribbon and a whisper. Don't look away now. Oakridge is listening. And what happens next will change everything. The sun rose slow over Oakridge. The next morning, it painted the porch steps with gold, warmed the fields with light. But inside the main house, the air was colder than ash, because fire speaks loud, but silence, after fire, speaks louder. Breakfast was delayed. Clara blamed a shortage of eggs and unrest among the help. The guests mumbled, confused. Some packed early. Others whispered about the smoke column they'd seen from their windows. Thomas said nothing. He sipped his tea, read from a newspaper that shook slightly in his hands. Martha watched from the hallway, carrying a tray. She saw the tremor. She saw the eyes behind the mask. And she knew he was afraid. Words spread faster than Clara could stop it. The overseer had heard rumors. The field hands spoke quietly near the stables. Even the children seemed to move more carefully, as if the ground itself had shifted. Martha didn't speak to anyone that morning. She didn't need to. The signal had been sent, and the house, for once, was listening. She entered the linen room just after noon, folded sheets, counted napkins, then opened a hidden panel behind the cabinet. Inside the ribbon, the burnt lace, a thread with Thomas's initials stitched in trembling red. She placed them in a small pouch, rubbed it tight, and handed it to Sarah. "Go to town," she said. "Give this to the Reverend. Tell him it's from me." Sarah hesitated. "What if they stop me?" They won't," Martha said. "Not if you walk like you're free." Outside, the fields were eerily quiet. No whistling, no humming, just the steady rhythm of hose against soil. The Whitmores didn't come out to greet the workers. And Thomas stayed inside, staring out the window, watching Martha. Later that evening, the master finally spoke. He called Martha into the drawing room. She walked in calm, apron neat, hands folded. James Whitmore cleared his throat. "We heard about the fire," he said. Martha nodded. "Yes, sir. You lit it?" "No, sir. But you knew." "Yes, sir." A pause. "Why?" Martha looked him in the eye. Soft, firm, to remember. Another pause. Longer this time. Martha," he said slowly, "not everything needs to be remembered." But Martha only said, "Some things don't need permission." She turned and left the room, and Whitmore didn't stop her. That night, as the lamps dimmed and the house settled, Thomas stood alone in the hallway. He looked at the spot where Martha had passed him hours earlier. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the bundle he'd taken from the cellar, unwrapped it. Inside, a child's shoe, scorched. He stared at it, and for a flicker of a moment his hand trembled again. Then he placed it into the fire, watched it burn. But Martha had already made copies. And sent the truth outside Oakridge's gates. Your house can bury memories, but it cannot contain truth once it begins to walk. Stay close. Martha's story isn't finished, and the next knock at Oakridge's door won't be one they expect. 2 days after the smoke rose, a visitor came to Oakridge, not a guest, not a buyer, not a neighbor bringing spring pies. He arrived alone, on a gray horse, wearing a plain coat, with no servant at his side. He rode slow, quiet, and with purpose, and when he dismounted, he asked for only one person, Martha. Is she here? Clara tried to intervene. We don't take visits without notice. She sniffed. But the man only removed his hat and said, I'm not here for tea. James Whitmore stepped forward, mesmered at him with a wary glance. Who are you? Just a man who's seen smoke, the visitor replied. And listened to the people it came from, Clara scoffed. Are you with the authorities? No, ma'am, he said. But the truth doesn't always wear a badge. And then, behind the parlor curtain, Martha stepped forward. She looked at the man for a long moment. Recognition flickered behind her eyes, and then she nodded. I'll speak with him, she said, Clara protested. In our house? But James raised a hand. Let her go. Perhaps he thought it would calm things. Perhaps he thought it would pass like the smoke. But the moment that visitor stepped into the wash-house with Martha, the tide shifted. Inside the man laid out what he knew. He'd seen the ribbon, read the notes, heard whispers from field hands and church folk. He knew the name Grace. He knew about Samuel. He knew what Martha had carried quietly for 7 long years. But more than anything, he knew the weight of fire. My sister, he said, died in a house not unlike this one. The family called it an accident, said the wind took the candle. But I saw the burn patterns. I smelled the truth. Martha nodded, eyes steady. Then you know what I carry. He looked at her carefully. I do. Outside, Thomas watched from the top-floor window. His fingers curled on the sill. He couldn't hear their words. But he saw the posture, the calmness, the way Martha stood without flinching, and it unsettled him more than flames. Because guilt fears the quiet ones most, the ones who don't shout, the ones who wait. No, the visitor left within the hour. No threats, no drama, no public scene. Just a quiet word to Whitmore at the gate. I'll be in touch. And with that, he mounted the gray horse and rode back the way he came. But the tension he left behind stayed that night. Martha slept for the first time in weeks. Not deeply, but without trembling. And Sarah, curled nearby, asked the question that had hung in silence too long. Will there be justice, Mama? Martha looked at the rafters above, listened to the creak of the wind outside, and said softly, There will be. Truth, when stories long buried find a voice, even the walls begin to listen. Keep watching, because the reckoning isn't always loud. Sometimes it knocks once and waits. Oakridge had always been a house of sealed doors, half-truths, and careful whispers. But sometimes it isn't a shout that undoes a legacy. Sometimes all it takes is a letter left open, on the wrong desk, on the wrong day, in the wrong hands. It happened on a Monday, a letter addressed to Miss Clara Whitmore. Nothing unusual about that. Clara received correspondence from town almost daily, orders for silver polish, fabric, guest invitations, or reminders for church luncheons. But this one was different. It had no return name. The paper was thick, crisp, and the handwriting was careful, precise. She never saw who brought it in. Some said it was a young boy. Others swore it was left under the parlor vase. But by midday, Clara opened it, curious, distracted, and then pale as linen by the second paragraph. Thomas entered the room moments later. What is it, She tried to fold the letter quickly, but he stepped forward faster than she expected. His eyes scanned the lines. The silence that followed was ice. The letter was from the visitor, but it wasn't addressed to them. Not truly. It was meant to be found, left open, left whispering, inside. It described events, not accusations. The Easter smoke, the visit to the cellar, the discovery of fabric fragments bearing initials, the ribbon, the shoe, and the final lines chilled the room. Oakridge sits on a bed of bones, and its lilies bloom from ash. Whether justice comes by law or by legacy, the house will answer. Thomas slammed the paper down. Lies. Clara looked at him for the first time in years, differently. Are they? She asked, voice thin. He glared. You think I'd... I think, she said slowly. I've stopped knowing. That night, the servants felt the shift. The Whitmores no longer shouted orders. Thomas didn't eat dinner. Clara remained in her room. And Martha? She stood at the top of the stairs, wiping the banister slowly, listening, watching, waiting. Now, the next morning, the field hands gathered early. One of them held a copy of the letter, not the original. A duplicate. Martha had sent more than one. Sarah asked her, "What happens now?" And Martha, eyes on the sunrise, replied, "No. Now we let the wind carry it." By noon, whispers of Oakridge had reached the general store. By nightfall, the chapel. By the next week, the courthouse. But still, no one marched on the gates. No one called Thomas by name. Because justice doesn't always arrive in daylight. Sometimes it waits. Not all revolutions begin with fire. Some begin with paper and ink. Stay close. The house is unraveling. And the next page, maybe it's lost. Spring returned to Oakridge. The lilies bloomed early that year, bright white against the worn wood of the estate. Like the house itself was trying to forget. But those who walked its halls hadn't. Because this Easter wasn't just a day on the calendar. It was an echo. And echoes, once loosed, never quite die. The Whitmores insisted on keeping the tradition. Clara baked the same pies. The table was set with the same china, candles lit just before sunset. But the guest list was shorter, the laughter thinner, and the rooms colder. Even the house seemed to breathe quieter, like it knew it was being watched. Because it was... Thomas sat at the head of the table, not quite smiling, not quite frowning. Just there, a man too haunted to lead and too proud to step aside. Martha moved through the room with grace. She served bread, poured cider, and wore the same apron with the blue ribbon stitched near the hem. A ribbon no one dared mention anymore. The meal passed slowly. No one spoke of the past, not of Samuel, not of Grace, not of smoke, not of letters. But when the second course arrived, duck with blackberry glaze, Clara raised her glass. "To traditions," she said quietly, and Martha paused, because that was the moment she'd waited for. She placed the final dish in front of Thomas, looked him in the eye. "No," and asked, loud enough for the room to hear, "No, shall I say grace, sir?" In a pause, Thomas blinked. Clara looked down. And a single guest, new to the table, looked up, curious. "Yes," Thomas said, finally, voice dry. "Go ahead." Martha folded her hands and spoke, not a prayer of thanks, not of blessing, but of memory. We remember those not seated, the ones whose names were never stitched into napkins, the ones who walked these floors barefoot and left behind nothing but echoes. The room froze. Cutlery stilled. Even the wind outside seemed to hush. She ended simply, let what was hidden, stay no more, then sat down. Dinner continued, but no one tasted the food. The ghosts had arrived, and this time they were invited. Later that night, after the guests left, Thomas stood on the porch alone. The field stretched before him, silent, watchful. Behind him, the windows glowed dim, and in the yard, near the tree where lilies bloomed thickest, Martha stood with Sarah. No words, just stillness. Thomas looked at them once, then turned away. The next morning he was gone, left no note, no farewell, just an empty seat. And a name that no longer held power in the place it once ruled. Right? Some endings don't need flames. Some houses fall in silence, one chapter left. And in it, we see what survives when the past is no longer denied. Oakridge did not burn. It didn't crumble, collapse, or sink into the ground. Right? It remained, standing, breathing, with its lace curtains and rocking chairs and silver forks still lined in drawers. No, but make no mistake, the house was never the same again, because the house had listened. No, and once a house listens, it cannot unhear. In the months that followed, the Whitmore name faded from town gossip. Some said Thomas left for New Orleans. Others whispered about debts, or shame, or worse. Clara stayed a while longer. But the garden grew wild. And the piano went untouched. Eventually, she too vanished from the porch. The wind reclaimed her rocking chair. And in that space, new hands took hold. The fields didn't close. The tools didn't rust, because Martha stayed, not as a servant, but as the last witness. She taught the younger girls to sew, who taught the boys to mend windows, build chairs, carve names in stone, not the names of masters, but of mothers. Sisters, children, names no one had stitched before. Sarah grew into a woman of fierce grace. She took over the washhouse, but the apron she wore was new. No stains, and no ribbon hidden in the hem because secrets had no place left to hide. The townspeople noticed the change. Oakridge still stood, but it no longer stood above. The fence came down, the fields opened, and the house, once bloated with silence, breathed something close to peace. Years passed, then decades. Some came to see it, the house where stories once died in the shadows, and they were met not with whispers, but with Martha, old now, soft-spoken but clear. She would sit on the front step telling visitors about the lilies, in how they bloom best near places touched by fire, how some stories grow stronger when passed through the ash. She never spoke Thomas's name. She never needed to, because the story was no longer about him. It was about those who endured, those who stayed, those who outlasted the silence. Right? One spring morning, when Martha's hair had gone silver and her breath shorter, Sarah found her sitting beneath the tree, still and quiet, a soft smile on her face. A breeze moved through the lilies, the house creaked gently, and the porch light flickered once, then steadied. They buried her by the tree, no grand stone, no marble plaque, just wood, and her name. Martha, who kept the house honest, and below it, she spoke, and the house listened. You've just witnessed the story of Martha of Oakridge, a woman who turned a home of silence into a place of truth. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel, share her voice, and stay with us. Because history is not just what happened, it's what survived. And somewhere, even now, another house is listening.